I'll be discussing the ways in which 1974's Blazing Saddles by Mel Brooks and 1973's Westworld by Michael Christian restage and revise the generic conventions of the Western genre. Looking back at the golden age of cinema, the Western genre was at its peak in Hollywood, producing over hundreds, if not thousands of Western movies every decade, from the 1930s to the late 1960s. As Western stories became repetitive and dried out like the desert these films were shot in, nobody cared about cowboys and Indians anymore. They became boring and mundane, and once the 70s rolled in with its gritty action, gory horror and crude comedies, the market audience just wasn't in the mood for another Western. But Blazing Saddles and Westworld took the generic conventions of the Western and revamped them to shape a modern audience. Of course, one being a spoof of the Western genre and the other being science fiction thriller, they still take the classic formulas from the generic Western conventions. These conventions being the stranger that rides into town, the duel, and the partner. Starting with one of the more obvious conventions of the Western genre is the stranger that rides into town. This classic Western trope focuses on our protagonist arriving into a town that usually faces some sort of trouble or turmoil. Whether it's a vicious gang of outlaws, savage Indians, or corrupt politicians, the stranger is usually there to help save the town from the corruption and then rides off into the sunset at the end once they have had their duel with the big grubby antagonist. In Blazing Saddles, the film centers around Bart, a black slave who has just been made the new sheriff of a racist town. The town has been attacked and pillaged by gangs secretly controlled by Hedley Lamar, a corrupt politician who was also sent the new sheriff. But the town eventually takes a liking to the sheriff, as he hilariously finds solutions to each problem Lamar throws at him. Of course, this film is a direct parody of the Western genre, so the conflict solutions Bart takes usually reflect something of a Looney Tunes cartoon.
Candygram for Mongo. Hey, Mongo. Sign, please. Thank you.
Mongo like candy.
But the idea of the stranger that rides into town being a black sheriff still breaks the classic conventions of the Western genre. Before we had Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, the representation of African Americans in Western cinema was little to none. With the thousands of Westerns being produced by Hollywood before the 70s, the most noticeable films to name would be Sergeant Routledge, 100 Rifles, and Buck and the Preacher. Other than these films, black people are either given small role or are unseen in most Westerns. Of course, slavery in America was still prominent at this time and was a touchy subject to portray on screen. Blazing Saddles takes this concept and adds humour to it. Of course, critics were split by this, saying the film was racist and crude, but others say it does the opposite. Whoopi Goldberg commented on the film saying, "It deals with racism by coming at it right, straight, out front, making you think and laugh about it." Taking a look at Westworld and the concept of the stranger, we focus on Peter Martin. Peter and his friend John go to Westworld, a famous amusement park. Westworld is a realistic park that's supposed to resemble the classic Old West. There are other parks as well, such as Medieval World and Roman World. Each park contains advanced, lifelike androids acting like the people of the town. The advanced technology is supposed to parody animatronics from famous amusement parks such as Disney. But one can argue that even though Peter is our protagonist and stranger that's new to town, that maybe the gunslinger is actually the heroic stranger instead. The world focuses on using AI as our slaves for enjoyment, being rewired and fixed to do what we say and desire, until the machines start to malfunction, going rogue and attacking the guests at the park. The gunslinger can be seen as the stranger, with no background into who he is, without even a name. He attacks the people that have murdered him time and time again, and that uses townsfolk for their own enjoyment. Whether it's shooting down his people, sleeping with them for their enjoyment, or making them attack each other for the satisfaction of winning a bar fight. The gunslinger is a stranger to the humans, but a hero to the machines. The second generic convention most seen in the Western genre is the duel. The duel is one of the most classic tropes of the Western genre, focusing on a standoff between the protagonist and antagonist as they stare head-on in a race to draw their guns and shoot the other. In Westworld, Peter faces off against the gunslinger multiple times in a duel. Unlike most Westerns though, the gunslinger keeps coming back to finish the job as he gets fixed by the engineers at the end of each day in the park. The guns in Westworld are programmed not to be able to hurt the guests, but when the park malfunctions and the machines go rogue, this changes and evens the playing field. The gunslinger returns and has a duel with John, Peter's friend, and murders him. Peter runs and the gunslinger chases Peter down all the way to medieval world where they face their final duel. Both of them lose their guns and it becomes a duel between the mind of man and machine. Peter stands under the lit torches of the castle of the medieval world, hidden from the gunslinger's sight as he can only see through a thermal vision. Peter uses these torches to set the gunslinger on fire, ending the duel and the movie. The duel restages its generic convention with a standoff that doesn't exactly end with the hero riding off into the sunset, but instead he is now haunted by the murders committed on what should have been a fun vacation with his friend John, ending the film on a dark note of reality. In Blazing Saddles, the duels are left to Jim, played by Gene Wilder, who refers to himself as the fastest hand in the world, referencing many Western tropes of a gunslinger being the quickest hand or shooter in the West. When Bart reunites with African American slaves that he was once a part of, later in the film, he is confronted by the slave owners. The slave owners point their guns at Bart, and Jim faces them in a standoff. The parody of this duel shows Jim shooting the guns out of all the men's hands so fast, we don't even see him pull the gun from his waistband's holster. Instead, we just see him blow on his fingers before they shoot, and then see him with his arms crossed after he shoots.
Said on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Bringing me to my final convention of the Western genre, the partner. These partners are almost like romances in the Western genre, having a love and admiration for each other, willing to die by one another's side. The partner's relationship is almost stronger, if not more so, than the typical narrative of the love interest. In Blazing Saddles, Bart and Jim hit it off almost instantly when Bart finds Jim locked up in his cell. Being Bart's partner throughout the film, and one of the few white characters that makes no racist comments towards Bart, Jim guides Bart through the conflict of the town and supports him when the town shows their racism towards him. Meanwhile, Bart encourages Jim to do better, and that he can do more than just drink himself to death. In the end, they both literally ride off into the sunset together in the finale of the film. Whereas in Westworld, Peter and John go to this amusement park together, getting up to classic Western hijinks, getting into bar fights and duels, going to the saloons and brothels, and living out their childhood fantasies of being partners in crimes in the great frontier of the Western America, even planning on robbing a bank at some point, until the gunslinger confronts the two and shoots John dead, leaving Peter to avenge his fallen friend. In conclusion, these two films may not portray themselves as classic westerns, as one takes a spoof on the genre and the other focuses actually in a sci-fi future. But nonetheless, the films still retake and revise the generic conventions, taking a genre that's been chewed up and spat out to the viewer thousands of times throughout the decades, and making it exciting, refreshing, and gritty.